In late spring, I had sown pole bean vines inside my protected cages. After perfect germination temperatures awoke the dormant seeds, the plantlets continued to grow at a constant rate. They had not been afflicted by any pest or disease and grew without much stress, despite never receiving additional irrigation from me. I had installed some cut branches in the center of the beds so they could climb up and colonize the upper story of this decorative protected bed. I had designed the roof structure precisely to perform as main supportive rafters for the vines to climb on. This would give my garden a more sophisticated and romanticized feel, all while serving the practical purpose of keeping edible plants out of the reach of voracious garden herbivores like groundhogs and deer. But the same removable chicken wire side panels that kept my plants safe from marauding animals happened to be a strong magnet for beans to climb onto. I could not let them take hold of the sides, as that would immobilize them, blocking me from having access to the interior for maintenance and harvesting, not only of future bean pods, but of other vegetables that I had growing together with them in this polyculture, namely butternut squash, okra, and a few lettuce heads that were still producing despite the approach of summer. So for a few weeks I had to regularly monitor the expanding vines, making sure to unravel the rogue ones, leading them to grow along the central branch structure so they would direct their expansion towards the roof of this bed. I could already spot several tiny bean pods forming. I knew that in just a few days I would have my first green bean harvest. It's already the first week of August. This is the dog days of August, and I can already hear the chanting, the humming of the cicadas in the background. It's going to be a hot day. But I know I have one positive saying, is that I'll probably get my first harvest of beans. I'm getting them this late because I planted them a bit later than usual, and the plants have grown beautifully. Just astounding even to see it from up here. As I fully expected, the vines have already covered the tops of the boxes, and I just have to have beans already. I hope so. I had seen a few pods a few weeks ago, but I hope to get a decent harvest. We'll see. I don't know if the structure is the optimal way of having beans be trellised, but at least I have to say one thing: the groundhog has not eaten one leaf up until now, and I'm happy that it's working as I intended it to work. The vines had formed a canopy of green over the structures exactly as I had hoped they would. One positive outcome of this design was that by reaching the higher parts of this bed, the vines got almost an extra hour of direct sunlight a day, since the shadow of the houses around it would linger for longer near the ground. This was a clear advantage of having them growing this way. I knew that the longer the vines were exposed to direct sunlight, the more energy they would capture and the greater my potential harvest would be. Well, upon closer inspection, I do see there are some pods that have formed, and some might even be already too big. It'll be better to eat as shelled beans. But there are several small ones that are setting, and there is plenty of flowers. So perhaps this is not the main harvest yet, but it's a start. Let's take a closer look. The vines did display beautiful large leaves and were dotted with several flowers. Despite having to share the accommodations with other hungry crops like squash and okra, the leaves exuded health with a deep green hue. The most remarkable fact about all of this was that I had not watered this bed at all up until now. I was relying 100% on rainwater to keep them hydrated and growing strong. And by the looks of it, the strategy was working exceptionally well. Of course, I had a few tricks up my sleeve to accomplish this feat. For starters, not having to water is only possible in a naturally wetter climate like that of Maryland. We were having decent rains, and by keeping an eye on the soil moisture saturation, I knew that there was no need to add more. Despite these being raised beds, the soil was evenly moist. The spot I had picked happened to naturally collect more water when it rained. The grass there, before I built the beds, would grow thickly as this was a moist and sunny spot. I knew it would be perfect for vegetables, part of the reason why I had picked this spot in the first place. But mulching was my other secret to keep these plants water independent. Only if we experienced a drier spell in the coming months would I water them. For now, by adding an increasingly thick layer of grass mulch, the soil became more fertile and water retentive with each passing week. Being able to set up gardens that conserve water is a goal. It not only is an essential goal in arid climates like California, where water conservation is a must, it also makes gardening more enjoyable and less of a hassle. Having to water all your garden every day during summer because your soil is exposed is a waste of time and resources. I'll be back right after this commercial. Alright, this was a bit of a disappointment. I was expecting a lot more pods and I got a few. It's not enough really to prepare a meal, but it's only the beginning. So I have hope that things are going to turn around, and I do see signs that there will be a lot more coming because there are plenty of flowers and many small little pods that just developed. So maybe I just need to wait a week or so and I'll have at least a decent amount of beans. I only have a few plants here, so technically it's not going to supply me with a bunch of beans. I'm only starting out and testing the waters, but I expected a little bit more considering it's already August. But you have to give plants their time. This variety, the Old Homestead variety, is one that I've tried before and I was really pleased with how much production it gave in a small space. Maybe I have to think about expanding the area where they can climb. But all in all, it's, I'll say, mostly positive. We'll see. There are no signs of disease, and that's good for the beans. I hope I'll get a decent harvest soon. While the first fruits were but a humble parcel, I knew they were more of a sign of things to come than an omen for a failed harvest. They were a promissory note for an abundant harvest. Sure enough, just 7 days later, I returned to check on the growing vines with the hope of cashing out a larger amount of bean pods this time. The sunny summer days, interspersed by heavy thunderstorms, were providing the plants all the resources they needed to produce beautiful pods. Weeds and wild vines burst into flower, joining in this seasonal feast of pollination. The bees and wasps had been working tirelessly to pollinate all sorts of inflorescences. I could already see a beautiful sight amongst the bean leaves. There were several pendant pods waiting to be picked. All I had to do was stretch my hands and soon I would have a bowl full of green beans to enjoy. This specific variety can be eaten as green beans when the pods are young and tender, but I still think it is even better when allowed to dry. It always boggles my mind to just see the amount of production that just a few days can bring forth. One day you might not have anything, and then a few days later you have this bountiful harvest, and that's the case here. There are several pods that are in the perfect stage of picking, so this time I'm sure to get a good meal out of these few plants. There aren't that many vines here, but I think this first flush will be good as it can be, and hopefully it'll continue doing that on and on throughout the season. The hardest part of growing these beans would be harvesting them. They had required very little maintenance up until now, benefiting from weekly addition of grass mulch and a guiding hand here and there to lead them towards the higher, sunny canopy instead of the sides. Reaching the fruit from underneath inside the bed proved to be a little bit of a challenge. Having to weasel my way into the growing dense core of green vines and leaves was not that pleasant, especially having to contort my body to reach some of the pods. That made me think that an arched corridor would have been an even better structure to grow these in, so I could comfortably walk beneath them, harvesting the dangling pods. This was something to consider for the future. Maybe adding such a feature to my growing garden would elevate it not only in practical terms, but also visually. But otherwise, I could not complain. This was turning out to be a very successful harvest, and with several weeks of hot weather still to come, I was sure to get several flushes of bean pods. Eventually, I would allow the pods to remain so I could have a final large harvest of dry beans. As I said before, I think that the Old Homestead variety tastes best as a dried bean, so I surely wanted the plants to have enough time to produce a good amount of fully mature pods close to the end of the season, before the frost happened.